The spelling rules for the use of accents in modern Spanish are clear and precise, but it wasn't always like that. In fact, you might wonder where the use of accents in our language comes from and why these marks are present in all languages. Romances. Join us as we explore a bit of history to find the origin of the use of these orthographic marks, omnipresent in formal writing, and that have, in a way, become a representative of an entire language. At first, Spanish spelling didn't have a way to graphically indicate the accentuation of words. In fact, no type of accent can be seen in the manuscripts from the Middle Ages, and it barely appears in the first printed works after the arrival of the printing press in Spain in 1475. Only from the middle of the 16th century, after several centuries of writing, in this language, the use of diacritical marks to show the stressed syllable in certain words is documented. As happened in other European Romance languages, Spanish incorporated diacritical marks from Greek in order to indicate the accent. In Greek, accentuation was mainly manifested in a tonal way, with rises and falls in pitch, and it could fall on any of the last three syllables of the word. To represent it, Greek scribes from the Alexandrian period in the 3rd century before Christ devised a system with three marks. The acute accent, which indicated a rise in pitch, the grave accent, which implied a lesser elevation, and the circumflex, which reflected a rise followed by a fall in pitch. In Greek, practically all words, polysyllabic and some monosyllabic ones, were written with an accent on the affected vowel, except for specific cases. In Latin, on the other hand, accentuation was only allowed on the penultimate or antepenultimate syllable. Its position depended on the pronunciation of the vowel in the penultimate syllable. If it was long, it was accented and the word became paroxytone, for example, auriga. If it was short, the accent shifted to the previous syllable, resulting in a proparoxytone word like modicus. Educated speakers distinguished between short and long vowels in pronunciation, and perhaps for that reason, they didn't feel the need to reflect that information with signs. Only around the 4th century AD, some Latin grammarians resorted to Greek accents to write in Latin. Around the 15th century, the humanist movement promoted the re-editing and circulation of classical Greco-Latin works. Several European languages then began to adapt Greek diacritics to reflect accent according to their own patterns. Italian was the first European vernacular language to introduce accents in its writing and text from the late 15th and early 16th centuries. In those works, the grave accent was used irregularly, especially on oxytone words, and less frequently the acute accent in other positions. A few years later, during the second decade of the 16th century, the French adopted those same diacritical marks, following the Italian model. It wasn't until the second half of the 16th century that Spanish writings began to place accent marks on the vowel of the stressed syllables in certain words. However, these resources wouldn't become common until the following century. So much so that the first editions of works like Guzmán de Alfarache by Mateo Alemán from 1599 or Epístolas Familiares by Antonio de Guevara from 1595. And even the comedies of López de Rueda, published in 1620, lack graphic marks to indicate the accent. By the 17th century, the use of accent marks became widespread, and from the 18th century on, graphic accentuation became a common practice in Spanish publications. The first examples of texts with graphic accents date back to the second half of the 16th century and the early 17th century. They mostly use the grave accent, generally placed on the last syllable. As was the case in Greek and Italian, the use of the other two types of accents, the acute and circumflex, was sporadic and much less frequent. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell to remind you when there's a new video. In those early printed works where the use of graphic accents can be observed, these marks served a distinctly diacritical function, as they were used to distinguish words made up of the same letters, but with different prosodic accents. Thus, it was used to differentiate the forms mudó, habló, mandó, está, dejé, or igualará from their flat counterparts, mudo, hablo, mando, está, dejé, or igualara. In addition, the grave accent was used on monosyllables formed by a single vowel, such as in the conjunctions e or u, the preposition a, and occasionally the verb form a from the verb haber, today, haber. In some cases, the circumflex alternated with the grave, for example, cargara or despacho, or it was used in terms like fe or ver, to indicate the former presence of a double vowel before fe and ver. The acute accent was very uncommon and was almost always used on inner syllables. Even with these tendencies, the use of each type of accent was quite irregular and inconsistent, even within the same text. At the same time, many authors of orthographic treatises dedicated to standardizing Spanish writing proposed various rules for the use of graphic accents with varying degrees of strictness and acceptance. All of them, however, agreed on restricting them to certain cases, unlike the Greek rule, in which practically all words carried an accent mark. In general terms, the scholars advised using the accent mark only when a word could have more than one prosodic accent, or when it was an uncommon term whose accentuation could cause uncertainty. Some also proposed including the accent mark on one-letter monosyllables, like the preposition a or the conjunctions a, eu, u, e, or using it in a way similar to the current accent mark. Diacritic on monosyllables, with the pronoun el, distinguishing it from the article el, and the verb forms de and se to distinguish them from the preposition de and the pronoun si, respectively. Regarding the signs used, many manuals mention the three types of accents: acute, grave, and circumflex, describing specific uses in relation to the position of the stressed syllable. However, most ended up recommending the exclusive use of just one, generally the acute accent, although in practice at the time, the grave accent continued to be preferred for a long period. Starting in the 18th century, the acute accent began to be used more uniformly in printed texts to mark the stressed syllable. In fact, in the orthography prologue of the Diccionario de Autoridades, from 1726, the Royal Academy definitively chose the acute accent as the standard form in Spanish. Meanwhile, the grave accent was restricted in that work to terms formed by a single vowel, for example, the preposition a and the conjunctions e, o, u. This limitation would not last long, since in the first academic orthography of 1741, the use of the acute accent was also recommended for these words. For its part, the circumflex began to function as a purely graphomatic, diacritical mark, which helped clarify how certain graphemes should be pronounced. For example, ch or x in monarchia or exam, when in certain learned words, they did not follow their usual sounds of ch and j, but rather k and k's respectively. This circumflex accent disappeared as orthographic reforms eliminated the use of the digraph th with the value of k and x with the sound of j. Little by little, the successive editions of the Academy's orthographic treatises increasingly adjusted and defined the rules of graphic accentuation. It was not necessary to show the accent mark in all cases, but only in those that required it. In this way, words that followed the most common accent pattern in Spanish would not have an accent mark, while those that deviated from that pattern would be explicitly marked. This explains, for example, why it was prescribed to place an accent mark on esdrújolas words, and why it was established that monosyllabic words should not have one, except for later exceptions that led to the current diacritical accent allowed on monosyllabic words. And that's all for today. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to this channel. I also invite you to activate the bell so you'll be notified when there's a new video. See you soon.